One of the questions that I get asked the absolute most, both on social media, but also from my guests that I host on Safari, is how to handle noise when photographing wildlife. So that's what I want to talk about in today's video. I want to give you a few tips and tricks that I personally use when photographing wildlife to limit the noise levels. I'm Carolina Nari. I'm a full-time wildlife photographer and photographic guide, which means I am out in the field photographing wildlife a lot. A big part of my job is teaching wildlife photography, both to my guests who join me on Safari, but also through social media and digital resources that I sell on my website. So if you want to come along on my adventures in the bush and learn more tips and tricks along the way, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to not miss the next video. Cute. First of all though, before I dive into these different tips and tricks, I do want to say something because I find that a lot of people let it hold them back when photographing wildlife. It's the fear of noise in our photos. We need to stop being so scared of high ISO levels and high noise levels in our photos because it is holding us back. When photographing wildlife, 90% of the time we want to capture action and we want to freeze the motion, which means we need to use higher shutter speeds. Most of the time we're photographing moving subjects while shooting handheld from a moving vehicle, which means we have to use high shutter speeds. Most people also use zoom lenses that maybe have an f-stop of around 5.6 to 7.1 maybe, unless you have the budget for a 2.8 lens. Then we can only compensate so much of light intake with our f-stop, and the one thing left to do is simply raise our ISO. And my biggest advice to you is to wrap your head around the fact that you're going to have to shoot at higher ISOs, and that is okay. I see way too many photographers who have this huge fear of shooting at a higher ISO, and that means they have to compensate with a slower shutter speed. And unless you lower your shutter speed so much that you actually intentionally get motion blur, like when you're panning, for example, you end up getting these half blurry photos that are maybe slightly sharp but not really, and the quality of the photo just isn't what we're looking for. So rather have a higher ISO with a fast enough shutter speed than a blurry photo with a low ISO. Please, please, please just wrap your head around that first before we move into these next few tips, because we need to stop being so scared of high ISOs. First of all, the maybe most obvious one is the denoising in post-processing. And this is such a lifesaver and absolute game changer for wildlife photographers, and is the reason that I am no longer scared at all to shoot at high ISOs, because I know I can deal with the noise in post-processing. So if you photograph wildlife a lot, or in general just photograph a lot in low light situations, I would highly recommend investing in a denoise post-processing program, because it's going to save you so many photos. I personally have tried 3 different major post-processing programs, the first of all being Lightroom Classic's own program that I actually think is really, really good. When it first came out, I was not too impressed, but now with different updates, I think it has been really nice to use, and it's obviously the one that is easiest to use integrated into the Lightroom workflow. So if you already own Lightroom Classic and you don't really want to invest in one of the other programs, keep using Lightroom's denoising because it's fantastic as well. Personally, I've been using Topaz Labs for years and I highly recommend that. I like the way that I can integrate this into my Lightroom workflow, because I often will edit a photo a little bit first, do my basic adjustments, and then denoise it, and then do my more advanced adjustments and finish off the photo. And this just works quite nicely with Topaz, because I export the photo from Lightroom into Topaz, I denoise it, and then when I bring it back into Lightroom again, all the sliders that I've been using are reset, and I can actually push them a little bit further if I want to. So personally, I just like this workflow. It's just because I've been doing it for years, but that is one of the reasons that I really like Topaz. Other people, this might be a downside, because you obviously can't go back and make changes of anything that you've done before you denoised it, which you could do if you're using Lightroom Classic's own denoise program. However, recently I was introduced to DxO denoising program, and personally I think this has been absolutely incredible and is actually one step up from Topaz. Other people might have different opinions on this, but I think it has been insanely good. However, I am struggling a little bit with the workflow together with Lightroom. It's just a bit weird when you export it from Lightroom and then bring it back in again. It just imports the photo in a weird way again, and it just slows down my workflow a little bit. So I am struggling with that, but hopefully they make some updates and maybe this is something that in the future will be fixed. But in general, for the quality of the denoising, I think this has been amazing. Lastly, what I want to mention when it comes to denoise in post-processing is that you are never going to get the same quality of low noise levels as you would have gotten if you were shooting in great light with a ISO of 100 in camera. When we denoise our photos, we just want to limit the damages that high ISO levels might have created when photographing in low light situations. So when you do denoise your photos, don't try to push it to absolutely eliminate all noise in the photo. Just denoise it to the point where the noise isn't distracting from what you're trying to tell with the photo. It doesn't have to be absolutely completely noise-free. I think a lot of people make the mistake of trying to make it absolutely noise-free, and then you end up with a fake-looking photo that doesn't have a lot of details. As an example, I was photographing this leopard a couple of weeks ago with a ISO of 64,000. Just saying that again, 64,000 ISO. That is wild. That's a very, very high ISO level. I know a lot of people would think that that photo would be absolutely unusable. But after post-processing in Lightroom Classic's own denoise program, I was able to get a photo that is very much usable. There is still a little bit of noise in this photo, as you can see, but I find that it's not to the point where I feel like the photo is unusable. And especially posting on social media, nobody is going to notice. So just take that with you, that you can use very high ISO levels in very low light situations and still get a very much usable photo. My second tip for limiting noise levels in your photos might contradict a little bit what I was talking about earlier when I said you mustn't be scared of using high ISOs. And I still stand by that, because when necessary, when you need to have a certain shutter speed for fast-moving subjects and so on, then do that and don't be scared of the high ISO levels. You just have to do what you have to do to get the photo. But what is important to remember as well is to keep an eye on that ISO and make sure that you're not shooting at crazy high ISO levels because you have a super fast shutter speed for something that is not necessary. I personally shoot on manual with auto ISO, and if you want to know more about my specific wildlife settings, I'm happy to make a more deep dive video on what I do in certain situations and different settings that I use and so on. But in general, I shoot with manual and auto ISO, which means I have control over my aperture and my shutter speed, but then the camera decides the ISO for me. And this is just because it's easy when photographing wildlife and things are changing very quickly. I don't have to think about too much at once. But what I also do is, as soon as I get to a sighting, as soon as I photograph something, I always keep an eye on that ISO to make sure that it doesn't skyrocket unnecessarily. So for example, if you're photographing a bird in bright daylight sitting on a branch, you can maybe use a shutter speed of 1/2500 and your ISO will be on like 200, and you're perfectly fine with that fast shutter speed. Also, you're photographing a bird that might take off and you want to make sure that you freeze that motion when that action happens. But then let's say you continue moving on your game drive and then you find lions sleeping under a bush. Now, what you might notice is that when you photograph these lions with the same settings that you just a few minutes ago were photographing this bird at, because they're lying in the shade, your ISO is going to be a lot higher for the lions than it was for the bird sitting on a branch. Because the lions are sleeping under a bush, you don't need a shutter speed of 2500. You can bring it down to maybe 1/500, whatever you feel comfortable with photographing these stationary animals. Because when photographing wildlife, we're photographing in so many different light situations, we need to be able to just keep an eye on our ISO and make sure that we adjust our shutter speed accordingly and balance these two against each other. Making sure that you have a fast enough shutter speed for whatever the animal is doing, but you don't have an ISO that skyrockets unnecessarily. What I also do in low light situations is I photograph the animal at a comfortable shutter speed that I know I'm going to get a sharp photo for, depending on what they're doing and how they're moving and if we are moving. That's also very important to remember. If you're photographing from a moving vehicle, you will need a faster shutter speed than if you're able to sit completely still. So I get my safety shots, as I call it, first, and then I slowly bring down my shutter speed step by step, getting a few photos in each shutter speed, which essentially also brings down my ISO. And if I'm comfortable with it, I'm able to keep my camera still and the animal stays still. I have actually photographed animals at very slow shutter speeds of like 1/30 because I'm able to keep my camera still. I usually lean it on a beanbag that I have on the side of the vehicle and just bringing down that shutter speed slowly. Obviously, you do run the risk of the animal all of a sudden moving and then you get a blurry photo instead. So you just have to balance the risk of maybe getting a blurry photo if the animal does move with the chance of getting a photo with a lower ISO. Lastly, let's talk about the tip of handling noise in your photos that I don't hear a lot of photographers talk about. A very common mistake that I see a lot of photographers do, and myself included in the past, is to underexpose your photo in camera when you're shooting in low light situations, because that essentially brings down your ISO, and you would think that then brings down the noise levels, right? And then what a lot of people do is bring the exposure back in post-processing, thinking that you're getting a less noisy photo. However, this isn't the case, unfortunately, and you're actually doing yourself a disservice by doing it this way around. As you might know already, noise hides a lot more in the shadows and darker areas of your photo than it does in the highlights and brighter parts of your photo. If you're shooting at a underexposure in camera and then bringing back the exposure in post-processing, you're actually introducing a lot more digital noise and therefore getting a more noisy photo in post-processing than you would have gotten if you just exposed correctly in camera using a higher ISO. To take it one step further, it's actually better to overexpose your photo in camera and then bringing down the exposure in post-processing, even though that means you might need to use a high ISO and you feel like that might be introducing more noise to your photo in camera. The process of bringing down the exposure in post-processing, you're actually doing a denoising before you even put it through any programs at all. I know this might sound crazy to some people and doesn't really make sense, but please, if you don't believe me, go out and try it. Really important to mention though is that this only works when you're able to overexpose your photo without losing details in the highlights and the white parts of your photo. So in general, you want to be exposing to the right, as it's called, referring to the histogram, leaning a bit more to the right-hand side without losing details in the highlights. Because if you do lose details in the highlights, it's impossible to bring that back in post-processing. So when you're photographing in more tricky light situations where you do have highlighted parts of the animal and more shadowy parts for the animal, it is better to underexpose the photo slightly. But when you're photographing in soft, low light situations, it is better to overexpose the photo slightly to handle those noise levels. And those are my top 3 tips of how I handle noise in my wildlife photos. I hope you found this video helpful, and please don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this, or drop any questions in the comments. More than happy to help out. And if you want to learn more from me, more in-depth tips and tricks, you can check out my digital resources on my website. I'll put the link below. I have a full Lightroom course that goes through everything from the basics of how to handle all the different tools that we have in Lightroom to the more advanced edits and how I edit all my different photos using Lightroom Classic. So check that out in the link below.